So what I'd like to chat about today, just in 20 minutes or so, is what we've observed in government, in various agencies, in the contracting world, and how it relates to what other industries are going through in terms of digital transformation, IT modernization. I think what you'll find, one thing I'd say right off the bat is, and I have a slide actually to talk about this, the journeys are different across different industries and different segments, but the destination is largely the same. And it's an important one to get to, although I would say, if you just follow the popular press around the pace of organizations adopting cloud, you would assume that it's moving actually at a much brisker pace than it is. The reality is most organizations are still struggling with how to modernize their existing infrastructure, how to take cost out of it, how to make it efficient enough that they can carve off time and budget to go start the cloud journey, go stand up new workloads. So a big part of what we're focused on as a company is how we help that and prepare you for your cloud journey. I'm going to talk about what we see in the industry and then some of what we're doing in that regard. So first thing I'd like to start with, so I've been in this industry 37 years, so some of you are young enough that may not remember this, but back in 2003, Nicholas Carr wrote a seminal piece in the Harvard Business Review entitled, "IT Doesn't Matter Anymore." And his thesis was that there's no differentiation to be had. There's no way that IT can uniquely benefit customers, constituents. So the one strategy that's obvious is, minimize costs, outsource everything, don't treat it as a value creator. Now here we are, 16 years later, 13 years later, 14 years later, the world's completely changed. The fact of the matter is, customers have come to expect the pace of innovation that they see in consumer electronics and some of these things in every facet of their lives, right? Constituents for government, they expect new services that are online. It's not like there's a digital entrant that's changing government. It's really what our end users are all expecting, whether they're individuals, whether they're agencies, building defense systems or the like. The expectation is innovation's got to happen far more quickly, far more cost effectively, and as IT organizations, it's our job to think about what that means from the evolution of the application development model, the infrastructure that supports it, and how we engage with the constituencies that, both internally and externally. So when you think of digital transformation, there's a lot of terms for this. Digital transformation is sort of the one that people relate to. I find it kind of awkward because it's not like we're transitioning from analog, but for a buzzword, I think it's illustrative of what we're really trying to do here. And it's about three things from our perspective, as you see on the slide here. It's really about, as I said before, how do we get to a place where we can do rapid development, rapid innovation, rapid iteration that's far more responsive to whatever constituents we're serving, but is also far more cost-effective and flexible. So the end objective is to get to an environment that's far more agile, nimble, responsive. But at the same time, as we said before, it's interesting. There was a statistic that I saw just within the last week that said that most government organizations still spend 77% of their IT spend on maintenance and support. Now, on the surface, it sounds shocking, except close to the same statistic applied in commercial segments not even 2 years ago. So this is a challenge for every industry making the digital transformation journey. So a couple points, right? It's slower historically to get there than one might believe from the popular press, but it's also never been more urgent to get there. And as you see on the slide here, in the private sector, this is a CEO agenda, right? It's about the existential threats facing their businesses competitively in order to be serving their customers more effectively, competing more effectively, and the like. And all of this needs to be supported with process evolution, tool changes, management environment changes, fabric changes. So there's a lot that needs to change. And we've always been focused on how do you make that not a one-step dramatic change, but an evolution. So our view of the journey is it's got to be evolutionary. It's got to be respectful for what's in the environment today, that's consuming cost that needs to stay in place. Now I mentioned, the digital transformation journey, the IT modernization journey is very different for different industries. I'll give you an interesting contrast. Just in the interest of time, I won't go through too many examples, but if you look at telecommunications in the private sector, they're subject to all kinds of dynamic changes. So they've had the rate of subscribers growing dramatically, but they're not making any more money. In fact, their costs to revenue is exactly where it was, number one. So they haven't figured out how to make money. Number two, they have been eroded by the cloud providers, creating alternatives for access on the low end, and then their margin and eyeballs are being taken away from above through these over-the-top applications. So there's an industry that has decided en masse they need to move to aggressively digitally transform, move from hardware-based, appliance-based network infrastructure to all software-based, all software-defined. And the very relationships of suppliers and consumers in that market are changing. We used to have categories like NECs, network equipment manufacturers. They're not selling equipment in the form of appliances anymore. They're now software application providers to the carriers. In some cases, the carriers themselves are innovating and building their next generation software fabric. So there's an example of how dramatic it can be. An entire industry and its ecosystem is completely reforming. And for them, it is absolutely an existential threat. If you look at government, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more along the lines that I described before. Driving a lot of policies, open source first. That's about improving innovation, reducing costs. Your expectations that contractors are going to be doing the same thing. These are all different dimensions of the journey that are specific to government as an industry and the various elements. But nonetheless, the end destination is the same. The one other thing I will note, and we've been, as you heard Paul say, we've been shipping Linux for 22 years, we've been in the enterprise business more than 15, 62,000 customers or so around the world. What we understand is this can't be a wholesale change, right? The reality is many of your existing applications that live under that 77% maintenance budget aren't brownfield applications necessarily. They're not legacy. In some cases, they are and will remain some of the most strategic applications you have in the environment. The issue is they may not lend themselves to being refactored as a cloud-native app or an agile app, either for reasons of technology, right? They just architecturally don't lend themselves to that, or simple reasons of cost. It's not economically viable to do that. So we think the transition to cloud native to agile has to be A, evolutionary, and be respectful of the fact that a lot of those applications won't ever be cloud native, but absolutely need to be part of the fabric that you're building out. So the new and the existing can interoperate, they can share information, they can be leveraged in a way that you can maintain them for the long term. So IDC and Gartner have various terms for this. IDC calls it third platform. Gartner calls it bimodal. But that's really, I think, what we're talking about, that the end game is going to be bimodal, a mix of traditionally structured applications and infrastructure, as well as new cloud-native workloads and infrastructure to support it. So what are we looking for as we get to a digital enterprise? I mean, at simplest level, it's agility, flexibility, and scaling on demand. So the utility-like aspects of what you might see solely in a public cloud extended to on-prem and some mix of public and private assets. And what we really need to provide to achieve that are capabilities around building a hybrid fabric that's burstable, building an application model that's cloud native, that allows for scale out, for automatic placement and evolution, and then all the management and tools and processes to make that all much more automatic. I need to be pointing somewhere. There we go. Okay. So, and of course, the industry is responding on the technology side, companies like us and what's happening in open source generally, starting to focus on the technologies that are going to enable all that, from cloud to data and analytics to mobile and so forth. And what those all have in common, by the way, as you heard in the video, is the font of innovation for all those technologies are, in fact, open source upstream communities. But before I talk about that, I wanted to put up this slide. This is an IDC slide. And I think in one picture, it tells the entire story of how we see these digital transformations playing out over the next 5 years. And I won't torture you with the eye test, but let me just point out a couple things. So from a fabric perspective, what are IT decision makers looking for? They're going to be bimodal, as we talked about before, a mix of traditional, existing, and new. They're going to be hybrid. And they desire to have a mix of on-prem and public cloud resources and capabilities. On the public cloud side, they expect to have more than one public cloud provider. As much as the capabilities that are provided on those public clouds are compelling, they're looking for ways to balance the vendor community, balance the cloud providers to provide flexibility and help ensure that they've got their costs managed. So hybrid world, multiple public clouds. So reasonably complex fabric potentially. But at the same time, as you see here, they don't want to compromise the ability to have higher degrees of automation and flexibility, agility in the application space, single service catalog, consistent SLAs. So they want the richness of the flexible application model in Fabric with more flexibility, on-demand capabilities than we've ever seen before. And I think that's what's going to typify the successful digital transformation, and it's what the vendor community needs to rally to provide. There we go. Now, as I mentioned, there's the role for the traditional, but what we're really talking about in terms of a digital transformation for an IT organization, including in the government, is moving notionally to the right here, right? Starting to bring sort of cloud-native application models to the fore, maybe IoT-based or mobile-first. Leverage new development models to get there, the agile development processes and DevOps from an operational perspective. And the application model itself changes. It moves from monolithic, traditional three-tier client-server architectures to microservice-based, component, containerized applications, integrated via APIs. And you'll hear a lot more about this over the course of the day. So one other thing that we've learned with hundreds and hundreds of customers in both private and public sector is the digital transformation journey sort of ends with technology decisions. It starts with a corporate will to change. And you see this in every single industry, that it's really about the IT decision makers and whatever equivalent line of business partner you have agreeing that we need to change how we support and enable customers. And that means we need to start down a path of changing our application model to be more cloud native, more agile, more flexible, and the supporting infrastructure to evolve. So it's about mindset first and then culture changes, because organizations that have been developing software in the same languages with the same techniques for 20 years, this is not easy, right? And usually what you start with is an application or a team that becomes agile methodology based of some sort, and then starts tackling projects in a cloud native way. And then once you build success and experience, you start to span that out across the organization. A lot of process changes that are involved in this, and even the tooling to support the process is fundamentally different. And then of course, the technology is actually to build these native applications and the infrastructure to provide the basis for them. So one last thing that Paul alluded to that I just want to come back to. The innovation that happens in software today now is almost entirely born out of these open, collaborative upstream communities. And let me just give you sort of a sense of impact here. So first of all, what you see is cloud, big data, all these other things are all being innovated first in these upstream open source communities. To just personalize that for a second, to just give you the impact of the power of this model. So I'm responsible for all of Red Hat's infrastructure products. It's about $1.5 billion annually worth of software. Across all of those product lines, if you look at the lines of code we ship on a source code basis, Red Hat paid, employed, authored maybe 20% of that code. Yet 95% of that code was authored by somebody who got paid to write it, right? So the power of these communities is they're coming together to solve an important technical challenge. And you have collaborators, competitors, all sort of putting aside their differences to align around an innovation mission. And that's happening at a scale that's unprecedented now. The Black Duck team who's here today will tell you that there's well in excess of 1 million open source projects in the world on the internet today. That grows at about 30% a year. And that actually forms another interesting side effect. If you move to Agile, Agile is a rapid prototyping methodology at its core. Well, one of the things, if you're trying to prove out a concept in 6 weeks and you're inventing all that code from scratch, it's kind of hard to do that. What you find a lot of customers doing is they're actually using some of those million open source components to actually do that prototyping. So open source isn't just driving innovation. It's in the core underlying technologies, it's changing the development model. I mean, Agile is basically codifying what community development looks like in rapid iteration. So, and thirdly, it's actually a source of componentry as you start to build your new next generation applications. So, Ashesh is going to talk about Linux containers, so I'm not going to say anything other than to note that we see containers and Linux containers as a fundamental application development architecture and framework. And I will point out just very quickly, it's not just for cloud-native applications. You can actually get benefits by containerizing existing applications because they become easier to manage. You build denser server configurations. And if an existing application is reasonably well architected 3-tier client server, in fact, you can containerize elements of that application and now make some of that content or service available to the new. So don't overlook containers as relevant to your existing traditional or Mode 1 apps as well. So the end game, if you net it all out, the application model and architecture is microservices, orchestrated container-based applications. The platform is this open hybrid cloud, on-prem and mix of multiple public clouds. And DevOps becomes more and more the development process. Now, I will also hasten to say that, as an industry and we as a company have focused on not requiring you to set all these dials to 10 ultimately. Right? Because there are going to be cases where you may want to do continuous integration, create new versions of products every single night, let's say, but maybe you're not releasing them into your customer base. So you may do continuous integration, but not continuous deployment. You may have legal requirements that force separation in dev and ops. So how much DevOps you can apply might be variable. So a big part of our thinking is you've got to make these all dialable so that you can not only move at your own pace, but that your destination matches the environment you're trying to serve. So let's take the last few minutes and talk about how we've helped customers in the private and public sector start to move down this path. So there's a couple things about open source communities that people don't like to talk about. I just described the power that they bring, and it's all true, but it's worth remembering that those are communities of innovation. They're not communities of completion, right? They're really focused on solving a hard technical problem, sort of pushing it out the door, and they're on to the next. And that's great from an innovation standpoint, but it's hard from a consumption standpoint. So companies like Red Hat are in place to actually know how to commercialize those. So what don't they do well? Well, it's all the things that are sort of in the fit and finish category. User interface and user experience, even QA to some degree. Life cycling of components. So let me use the OpenStack example and sort of show you some of the complexity that lives behind this. So OpenStack as a community, very large, complex community, hundreds and hundreds of developers participating, including us. We're typically number 1 and number 2 committer. That releases every 6 months. In fact, we just had a release announced last week at OpenStack Summit in Barcelona. So every 6 months, a whole new set of innovations are being dropped into the industry. Installation, still tough. User experience, still rough. And no notion of what it would be like to put that in production and live with it for 3 years. So what companies like Red Hat have to do is understand enough about this community process where, again, we're only 20% of the contributors typically. How do we influence that? How do we solve some of those problems? Well, in each case, solving those shortcomings or problems with the innovation-centric community model involves code changes, right? So we never talk about the fact that we're the number 1 or number 2 committer to OpenStack because it's not relevant. What is relevant is we got to that number because we have developers and committers and experts on every single OpenStack module. And therein lies the magic to how we play in this world, because we have deep insight into what the community's thinking about the evolution, about what they're doing architecturally and technically, so that we know whenever we make a change in order to productize a release, a priori, it's going to be accepted back in the upstream process. That's critical, because if that doesn't happen, we've created a fork, right? We've created a unique path that's very expensive for us to maintain, or anybody like us. Worse yet, it puts you as a customer at risk, because you need to rely now solely on one vendor and their unique implementation. So it's really worth understanding both the model and how it works, because in most cases, for infrastructure, for application enablement, for management, the data suggests in the cloud era, customers, more so than in the prior generation, expect to consume open source in those areas supported by commercial vendors. This is the reason why. And you'll see, if you look at the OpenStack community news in the last week, there's folks that haven't figured this out, right? And so we've been steadfastly sticking to our model. And I think that's critically important as we go forward. So one quick thing before I just talk about our architecture and we move on to our next speakers. I think particularly in the government sector, both federal, state and local, almost across agencies, the need to think about how to make what you've got better, more efficient, it's sort of unprecedented. The notion of 77% of budgets are still being consumed with maintenance and support. So this is in the spirit of how we help think about bringing the existing into the fabric of the new. These are the kinds of things we see as important. So first, creating standard operating environments, right? Getting some of the differences out of the platforms that you've got. Standard operating environments, hardware, software, networking, to the extent possible to the extent you can in your environment. Second, virtualize every workload that's possible. It's amazing, virtualization technology has been around for a long, long time, yet the number of workloads that we can identify that are candidates for virtualization but that haven't been is actually quite extraordinary, right? So, and of course what you get with that, you get more efficiency, you get more easy management, and you get a lower cost of operation. But I would say the single biggest opportunity that not a lot of people have thought about is automation. So in our case, we acquired a company called Ansible just about a year ago. It's a beautiful general purpose automation tool. It's agentless, so it's easy to deploy. And it's got a very elegant automation language that anybody can understand and write playbooks based on. So it becomes a very elegant way, and it's not unique to DevOps or containers. It's a general purpose automation system that we've found very powerful for customers to automate existing environments and processes. Hugely, hugely important. And I can tell you the Ansible business is off the charts, and a lot of it is because we helped customers start to apply it to modernizing their existing environment. And then lastly, containers, as I mentioned, can play a role there as well. So let me just talk about what we've done uniquely to support these customer requirements. So first of all, it's fair to say that this whole discussion around cloud native is about the application. And it's about what kind of applications you want to build and what the characteristics of them are in terms of burstability, scale out, all those things. So the job of the infrastructure is to create optimized platforms for those workload types, be they traditionally architected, as you would see on the left with those that run on bare metal RHEL, or traditional stateful virtual machines, as you see on virtualization, or whether they're cloud native in the infrastructure like OpenStack for a scale-out platform, OpenShift, which Ashesh will talk about a little bit later, which is our container management and PaaS platform. So our vision has always been, if you want to make the fabric unified enough so that traditional and new can live together, the first thing you do is build all these platform elements that are serving different applications out of the same fundamental pieces. So it's all enterprise Linux. The container enablement is identical across any of these platforms. They're all able to be managed in the same way. And as you move to the right, you're looking at more and more cloud native, stateless kind of application models. Probably the most important thing from a platform perspective is the fabric I described, where it's bimodal, it's hybrid, it's multi-public cloud. It's very difficult to do that without creating abstraction choices for the application writers to build to. OpenShift is that ultimate abstraction in our strategy. So OpenShift, as a container management and PaaS platform, runs identically on-premise, whether you're running it on top of our OpenStack as a scale infrastructure or just bare metal, as it does on every one of the major public clouds, including our work with Azure at Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. And we have partnerships of varying levels of complexity with each and all of those. So you get an abstraction layer that has a full complement of services to let you build any application type in OpenShift. So run as an abstraction, you get identical application behavior on any public cloud and on-prem. That's complemented, as you'll see next, with what we do in terms of things like management, as we alluded to before. So, you've got cloud forms, as Paul alluded to, single pane of glass. It understands, it does, discovery, and then it can manage any workload type, be it a stateful virtual machine, as you see in a traditional context, whether it's a stateless virtual machine you see in an OpenStack context, or containers. Manage any kinds of those workloads across any one of those public cloud architectures as well as on-prem. So now you've got a unified management fabric that transcends that whole environment. So a single way to manage workloads, regardless of type, regardless of placement. And now imagine that you're starting to build automation on top of that with tools like Ansible. CloudForms can invoke Ansible playbooks to go apply automation to now, okay, maybe I want to move workloads in an automated way based on cost or based on latency or what have you. All that gets built in more and more and more. So you get a sense. At the same time, you've got other things that you're going to hear about today in terms of middleware. Our middleware is built to be consistent across the two environments so you can bridge across. So everything we've done is designed to create a single fabric that lets you support the traditional and the new across public and private clouds, and we do this in a more consistent and effective way than most anybody else out there. And as you can see, Jet Propulsion Lab came up earlier. Today here we are, OpenStack, the two leaders and founders of OpenStack, Rackspace and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, are partnering with Red Hat to provide their product capabilities. Because again, the community side of this gets very complex. So I think a great example, and we've got tremendous traction with many government customers across sectors. So with that, let me just say, we're supporting you wherever you are in your journey with a common set of capabilities, a common set of tools, and the ability to help with thinking about process and policy changes as well. So with that, sorry for being a couple minutes over, but thank you, and I know just knowing the lineup here, it's going to be an amazing day, so thanks very much.